From the perspective of a historian specializing in the Hung kings, the Ninth Hung dynasty can be understood as a particularly significant transitional phase in the development of ancient Vanlong. It was neither a mythical beginning like the earliest Hung eras, nor yet a period of intense upheaval before history moved toward more complex structures of power. Instead, the Ninth Dynasty existed as a deep pause in historical time, a moment in which Vanlong consolidated what had already been formed, while quietly preparing, both spiritually and organizationally, for profound transformations that would come later. By this stage, the territory of Vanlong had settled into a familiar agricultural rhythm. The Lac Viet people were no longer living in constant uncertainty before nature, as their earliest ancestors once had. Generations of experience in water control, wet rice cultivation, and seasonal organization had produced a stable relationship with the land. Under the Ninth Hung king, this knowledge was not merely practiced, but normalized. It became custom, village law, and unwritten convention passed down through memory rather than decree. Society no longer functions solely on individual experience, but on collective remembrance. One of the most defining characteristics of this period was the growing prominence of village and regional communities. The authority of the Hung king remained central in a symbolic and ritual sense, yet daily life increasingly relied on local self-governance. Village elders, regional leaders, ritual specialists, and individuals of spiritual authority played key roles in maintaining social balance. This reveals the emergence of a soft form of power, one not enforced through violence or rigid law, but through trust, recognition, and the ability to preserve harmony. Within this context, ritual continued to play a vital role, though its character became quieter and more enduring than in earlier periods. Large ceremonies were no longer focused primarily on pleading for protection from natural forces, but on reaffirming an existing order between humans and nature, between communities, and between the living and their ancestors. Bronze drums still sounded, and the image of the lockbird remained present, but these symbols no longer conveyed a sense of cosmic beginning. Instead, they functioned as steady rhythms sustaining social continuity. Spiritually, the Ninth Hung dynasty shows a clear development of historical consciousness, even in the absence of writing. The people of Vanlong began to view the past not merely as myth, but as accumulated experience worthy of preservation. Oral traditions about ancestors and earlier Hung kings were retold with increasing structure and purpose, less spontaneous and more instructive. History, in its oral form, became a tool for shaping ethics, behavior, and collective identity. This period also witnessed clearer occupational differentiation. Alongside agriculture, crafts such as bronze casting, pottery, weaving, and boat building developed steadily. The importance lay not in large-scale production, but in the emergence of hereditary skills and long-term reputations. Certain communities became known for particular crafts, forming durable networks of internal exchange. Vanlong thus evolved from a loosely connected landscape into a system bound together by labor, trust, and shared belief. In its relations with the outside world, the Ninth Hung dynasty adopted a cautious yet open stance. Contact between regions, and even with groups beyond the Vanlong sphere, occurred through the exchange of goods, techniques, and ritual practices. Yet the cultural core remained intact. This balance suggests a society confident enough to absorb new influences without losing its spiritual axis. The image of the Hung king during this era is not that of a constantly acting ruler, but of a symbolic anchor. The king appeared in major rituals and moments of confirmation, ensuring legitimacy and continuity rather than managing everyday affairs. This reflects an early model in which supreme authority existed to guarantee unity and meaning, not to micromanage society. At a deeper level, the Ninth Hung dynasty represents a maturation in how the ancient Vietnamese understood the human condition.
People no longer saw themselves as merely beings struggling against nature, but as conscious participants within a larger order. They recognized that sustainability arose not from dramatic action, but from the ability to maintain rhythm over time. This is why the era is rarely associated with violent events or heroic legends, yet it played a decisive role in shaping the enduring cultural character of early Viet society: calm, adaptive, community-centered, and deeply respectful of memory. Looking back across the entire sequence of the Hung dynasties, the ninth stands out not for conquest or spectacle, but for its capacity to hold society steady. It resembles a sustained bass line in a long musical composition, not the climax, but essential to balance and continuity. In its quiet endurance, Van Long accumulated the depth necessary to move into more complex historical phases, carrying forward an identity refined through time rather than forged in a single moment.
From the perspective of a specialist in the history of the Hung kings, comparing the 8th and 9th Hung dynasties allows us to observe a subtle yet far-reaching transition in the development of the Van Long polity. This was not a rupture or a revolutionary break, but a careful recalibration of social rhythm following a period of intense symbolic consolidation. The 8th Hung dynasty was a time when spiritual life reached its highest level of symbolic expression. The lac-bird in the bronze drum were not merely elements of ritual, they became a shared language of society as a whole. This was the era in which Van Long achieved a strong self-awareness of its own identity. Power, social order, and collective memory were all anchored through symbols, sound, and ritual. People lived within a dense spiritual environment where every major communal action was framed in relation to ancestors, the cosmos, and a sacred order. In this sense, the 8th dynasty can be understood as the period in which the soul of Van Long was fully shaped. As Van Long moved into the 9th Hung dynasty, these symbols did not disappear, but the way they functioned within society began to change. The bronze drums still sounded, and the lac-bird remained present on drum surfaces and in collective memory, yet they were no longer displayed with the same intensity as before. Instead, these symbols were gradually internalized into everyday life. The people of Van Long no longer needed large-scale ceremonies to feel the order of the cosmos, because that order had become habit, custom, and lived rhythm. The most visible difference between the two dynasties lies in social organization. Under the 8th Hung king, communities were strongly drawn toward major ritual centers. Spiritual authority, though non-coercive, was highly concentrated and radiated outward through ceremonies and the sound of the bronze drum. In the 9th dynasty, this authority became more evenly distributed. The roles of local leaders, village elders, and custodians of traditional knowledge grew more prominent in daily life. The Hung king remained the supreme symbol, but his presence functioned primarily as a guarantor of shared order rather than as a direct regulator of communal activities. Spiritually, the contrast is equally clear. The 8th dynasty emphasized the connection between humans and the cosmos through ritual and symbolism. The 9th dynasty, by contrast, emphasized continuity between generations through memory and accumulated experience. Stories of earlier Hung kings were retold, not only to sacralize the past, but to transmit lessons about conduct, responsibility, and communal norms. This marks the emergence of a clearer historical consciousness, even in the absence of writing. Economic life also reflects this shift. During the 8th dynasty, handicrafts, especially bronze casting, carried strong ritual and symbolic significance. Crafted objects served both practical needs and the affirmation of spiritual order. In the 9th dynasty, crafts continued to develop, but became more stable and specialized. Skills were increasingly tied to specific communities and regions, forming steady networks of exchange rather than peaks of ritual production.
This represents a transition from symbolic craftsmanship to craftsmanship as a foundational element of everyday economic life. The relationship between humans and nature likewise underwent adjustment. The 8th dynasty placed strong emphasis on maintaining cosmic harmony through rituals, seasonal ceremonies, and the sounding of bronze drums. In the 9th dynasty, harmony was sustained more through accumulated agricultural knowledge, production customs, and environmental experience. Rituals did not vanish, but they were no longer the primary means of negotiating with nature. People increasingly trusted their own capacity to adapt within an already established order. Taken as a whole, the 8th Hung dynasty can be seen as the moment when Vonlong reached a peak of spiritual convergence, while the 9th transformed that peak into a durable foundation. If the 8th created a shared rhythm for the community, the 9th allowed that rhythm to sink deeply into villages, households, and everyday habits. This quiet transition helped Vonlong avoid major disruptions as society expanded and became more complex. It reveals an early capacity for adaptation among the ancient Vietnamese, knowing when to concentrate symbolic power to consolidate identity and when to diffuse spiritual authority to ensure long-term stability. This is the most significant historical legacy of the 9th Hung dynasty when viewed in relation to the 8th.